feeling the voyage of the damned.
Even though he's terribly afraid, he says, at least you quote him in the book, saying, oh, he couldn't get out of his mind that, oh my God, there's a cell in the basement of the White House, this place that he passed all the time.
Yeah, and he loved, as a lot of immigrants do, he loved looking at the White House. You know, in a way, the challenge for Usman and the challenge for much of the book is I follow him over the 2 years after this moment as he struggles to reimagine America and reimagine his place in America and whether there is one. You know, in some ways, that's the real challenge we're facing now as we try to repair America's place in the world, its moral energy, is whether these values still are going to have resonance. And Usman's experiment, his life, is in a way an experiment about that.
You talk about his father, and you talk about September 11th. His father, a top security official from Pakistan.
Yeah, he's here. It's interesting because he's here doing a seminar down south when the 9/11 attacks occur, and he comes up to Connecticut College to see Usman. Just a few days after, and he gives a tutorial in the dorms about what's really happening in Pakistan. And ultimately, he says to Usman, hold on to your dreams. Don't let those be troubled or darkened by what's happening now. And interestingly, Usman, as other characters in the book, are really, in a way, testing American values at a time of peril and trying to get past so many of the perfidies, so many of the awful, harrowing disclosures of what the government has done, not only from other reporters, but certainly in this book, to say, where do we go from here in terms of America and its role in the world and American ideals? That's in a way why the word hope is in the book, because you see people trying to get their legs back and trying to restore their own moral compass. Interestingly, for either an individual or for a nation, you know, following one's moral compass, it's not that different. You know, ultimately it takes basic things like truth, humility, compassion, honesty, saying, I'm ready to move forward based on what I will say clearly I have learned.
Georgia has been in the news a lot. Russia has been in the news. You talk about uranium stings. You talk about the Armageddon test. You talk about the threat of nuclear Armageddon.
This is the big threat we're really facing right now, and all the folks involved are wild-eyed with fear. Why? Because America's diminished status in the world has meant we don't have the moral authority to leave the real battle of this era, keeping uranium out of the hands of terrorists. The world's awash in uranium at this point. The terror networks are out there, along with states, rogue states just wanting their own little bomb. They want to buy the stuff. You buy 35 pounds, you've got yourself a bomb like Hiroshima. And the key in terms of the challenge we face now is that unless America figures out a way to restore its moral authority in the world by essentially believing in American oaths and sticking with it, rather than, you know, a backdoor secret foreign policy that ruins our relationships with friends and undermines our credibility and our status. Unless we do that, we are going to probably have a real problem. And the Armageddon test, just so you know, is one of the main characters. It's a weave of them, who's the guy in the government who's responsible essentially for getting to the uranium before the terrorists do. What he wants to do out of desperation, frankly, is send teams out just to find out how easy it is to buy this stuff on the world black market right now, to buy it, have these teams sent out by the U.S. government, buy it, and bring it back into the United States to show our vulnerability as well, to shock the beast, the United States government and the world community, to show exactly the nature of the threat, especially the nature of the threat, with America's moral standing now in the basement.
What happens?
Well, ultimately, he gets thwarted in twists and turns. He tries mightily, but the bureaucratic energies of the United States to stand in his way, and importantly, the fact that the United States simply can't embrace a level of truth, the government, like that, and that ultimately what undermines them. And interestingly, Amy, at the end of the process, this fellow, Ralph Mullet Larson, says, one of the real problems is secrecy. The fact is, it's destructive. Let's get everything out in daylight. This hyper-secrecy culture that the government has slipped into and, frankly, carried forward is what ultimately will kill us.
He meets with Stephen Hadley. He meets with Mike McConnell. He meets with Michael Hayden, the top intelligence people.
He's a top guy, yeah. He's a top guy.
But he gets nowhere.
Essentially, no. And even though they admit to him, we have no plan. We have no plan on this score, the most important ostensible issue of this period. The United States at this point is lessened. And the fact is, the world, much less American people, can't afford for us to be in this reduced status because, frankly, you can't herd cats when you're the United States at this moment.
Speaking of uranium, did your investigations lead you to who was really behind the Niger yellow cake uranium theory that Saddam Hussein was buying?
Well,
from
you know,
Africa?
it seems like it was an echo chamber of those Italian forged documents. And, you know, and frankly, what's interesting is that you put that on one side, really a false claim. And then there's another disclosure in the book right on the point of the real uranium threat, is that I show that in terms of Georgia and Russia, which is now blowing up, is that there's a huge crisis in 2003 when there's a smuggling route from Russia through Georgia with highly enriched uranium, the real good stuff, the stuff that is used in bombs. We challenged the Russians at that point. Again, the United States is, you know, the status is such the Russians just almost ignore us, but they said, look, we're on the case, and they say, we've got it handled. Ultimately, in 2006, there's a second incident. It's the same network. The Russians won't tell us that. What it shows is that ultimately uranium might have been smuggled across 3 years there. This is exactly the nature of the crisis. The United States, being the black hat in much of the world rather than the white hat, cannot lead on this most crucial issue. And as you can see from this current situation with Georgia, you know, Bush says this or that, Putin all but laughs at him. Like, and you're telling me what, considering what you've done? Ultimately, you're down in the mud with us now. Get used to it. And really the challenge in this election season is how do we go about the difficult process when there's so much collected economic and military power in one place in America to restore moral energy. I frankly tell people you should go read stuff from Martin Luther King or Gandhi. They'll help you. They'll help you figure out the way it is actually done, and it takes values that, frankly, the United States government is anathema to embrace.
Speaking of young people, you go to Guantanamo, at least you talk about
Yeah.
what's going on there, and particularly focus on one young man.
There's an extraordinary story. The man who is really the unknown character that creates that Supreme Court case, Boumediene, that restores habeas rights to Guantanamo detainees. Just most recent case, just ruled. I actually get in the case of that man. He's a guy, a baker from Afghanistan, who was swept up as they dropped the, you know, the bounty literature, you know, feed your village, give us someone from the Taliban. He is innocent. What I did here, Amy, is I used my sources to get actually into the classified so-called information on this man. It is utterly absent. It is non-existent. What happened here is that by virtue of this one innocent man's status, various twists and turns unfolded that finally causes a self-correction, a modest but important one, where the United States, again, is forced by the Supreme Court to embrace the great writ of habeas corpus. The book, in this way, shows what single individuals can do, not just this man, Gizawi, the baker, but his lawyer, Candace Gorman, an extraordinary advocate who really keeps him alive. Right now, just so you know, I talked to Candace. Gizawi, the man who created such change, is dying in Guantanamo, and she is fighting desperately to keep him alive against the resistance, frankly, of much of those in the U.S. government.
And the Holocaust survivor's son, the military tribunal judge?
It's quite a story. He's the military tribunal judge who looks over the Gizawi case when it comes in front of the tribunal. He's kind of a ringer because he's actually a former intelligence guy among mostly lawyers in this process. And he looks at the evidence and said, there isn't any here on this guy. He rules he's not an enemy combatant. That fellow, Stephen Abraham, again, another basic, heroic, traditional American character trying to restore America to its proper place, says, I'm not going to back off. This man is innocent. One innocent man is all it takes to stop a system in America the way it's supposed to work. He's the guy who basically pushes back. Abraham is a Holocaust survivor's son, as you say, and he says it's about justice. He all but gets fired from Guantanamo, but ultimately, years later, he files a deposition saying, I'm a credible witness, I was actually a judge. That causes the Supreme Court to flip, grant certiorari to the case Boumediene, and that ultimately is sort of the heartening part of the book. Americans are taking hold of this issue across the country to say, this government doesn't really represent me, and I'm going to do something about it with my own actions.
And finally, the UN Refugee Commissioner that you profiled.
Yeah, she's an amazing character, too. Wendy Chamberlain. She was the former Pakistani ambassador under Bush, but she moved away from all of that, becomes the Refugee Commissioner. And Wendy says something extraordinary. She says, you know, at day's end, if we're true to our oath, we don't really have enemies, certainly no enemies that can't be easily defeated. If we want to be secure, America has to start embracing a kind of authenticity, to say we're not going to do backdoor ugly things that end up ruining our status